Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming back and joining us on this session. My name is Guang Chen. I am the Senior Director for the Water Global Practice here at the World Bank. Really, it's an honor for me to chair this session. I will keep my remark to minimum because you don't want to hear from me, but hear from distinguished panelists here. I just have a brief introduction. This session is about water and about sustainable development of water resources. And with us, three presenters. First, Professor Mushfiq Mobarak, who is a professor of economics at the Yale University with concurrent appointment at the School of Management and the Department of Economics. He's also a member of the board of directors at the Jamel Poverty Action Lab at MIT. And is published widely in the field of water and sanitations and across different general disciplines. The presentation is entitled No SH.T, or Special High Intensive Training, Demand Estimation with Strategic Complementarities with an application to sanitation in Bangladesh. And the second presenter is Professor Edward Glaeser from Harvard University. And again, I'm not going to make a long introduction. He's the professor of economics in the Faculty of Arts and Science, where he taught since 1992. He taught microeconomics, occasional on urban and public economics. I'm sure you probably heard of know about his book on Triad of the Cities in 2011. In fact, a few years ago, he was also a Western scholar here at the World Bank with the urban practice as well. And we also have our own Richard Damania, who's the global lead and lead economist for the water practice here at the World Bank. And before that, he was also a professor of economics in University of Adelaide in Australia. And he's also widely published, and recently, his work with our team is on something called Economics of Water Scarcity in a book entitled Uncharted Waters. You probably heard about it, and he will be presenting on that one as well. Professor Glaeser's talk is on water health and wealth. And then we also have Professor Jim Hall from Oxford University as a discussion. And again, I think many of you, I'm not going to go into detail. You can certainly Google them. He's the director of Environmental Change Institute in the University of Oxford, also professor of climate and environmental risk in School of Geography and Environment. Done a lot of work on climate-related risks in infrastructure system. In 2010, he was elected as a fellow of the World Academy of Engineering for his contribution to the development method of flood risk and analysis. Again, let me keep my introduction brief. I'll lead the floor to our first presenter, Professor Mobarak. And I think each of them will have about 15 minutes of presentation, and I'll have Jim to provide some discussion comments, and then we'll open the floor for a question and answer.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. So this paper is co-authored with Jim Levinson, who's a colleague at Yale, and Raymond Gutierrez. I won't make any more jokes about the title and just launch right into it. So that first word, the second word in the title comes from the fact that this is a paper about sanitation. And this is a complicated paper to present in 15 minutes, so I'm going to speak fast and skip over some details. It's complicated because it has both a large-scale randomized control trial plus some structural estimation, and I do need to explain how they come together before I can tell you about the results. So sanitation is important because globally about 1 billion people in still practice open defecation. About half or more of all rural Indians still go out in the open. So that's potentially a big public health crisis. Right? And so the only 2 points I want to make with this slide is, one, sanitation is important, and second, that when we're thinking about getting people to invest in latrines, use toilets, subsidies are an important part of our policy tools, right? So earlier work I've done, the paper in Science, we tried out many different strategies to get people to invest in toilets in rural Bangladesh, and subsidies work better than sort of just information campaigns or getting people together and getting them to make commitments or doing supply side strategies, working with masons who build parts and, deploying latrine sales agents, etc. We tried the whole gamut of things, and subsidies seem to be important because price is an important barrier to adoption. And that's not just true in sanitation, it's true for many other classes of development products that other people have studied. And so now that, if you think subsidies are important, then what makes the problem very interesting in the sanitation case is that we think that decisions about investments in toilets are interlinked across households. Okay, and there are many stories I could tell about why. The simplest story would be that it's about social norms. Okay, so if you're in a village in rural India, and all of you are going out in the open, then it's not so shameful for me to do it. Like the cost of going out in the open is low, and therefore the benefits of investing in a toilet, spending $50 on a toilet, is going to be low. Right? However, if I try to open defecate in Washington, D.C., that would be much more costly, right? You'd probably complain a bit more. Right? And so you might think that, depending on what people around you are doing, the benefits and costs of the behavior are very different. Okay? And so that can give rise to strategic complementarity, that if other people adopt around me, that actually makes it more likely for me to adopt facing the exact same price of adoption. Okay, I could tell other stories as well. So, for example, the epidemiological complementarity would be that if I use a toilet, then my family members or my networks, they learn that this is a technology that might work for them, right? And they might do it. Or if we're a village and all of you are going out in the open, right? Then me adopting a toilet might just be wasteful. In that. Okay, great, thanks. Me adopting a toilet might just be wasteful because my kids are going to get sick anyway, because the fly doesn't care about whose feces it sits on before it sits on my food, right? So for all of those reasons, like what happens around me is really important to determining whether I choose to invest in a toilet or not, okay? And so when you have these kinds of interdependencies, right, the optimal subsidy policies are unclear. And here's why, right? So imagine that we had a budget of $100 to distribute in our village, okay? So should we be, given that decisions are interlinked and what I do affects everybody else, should I be giving $1 to all 100 of us? Or should I be giving $2 to 50 people? Or should I be giving $50 to 2 people and getting, a few people to subsidize them intensely, get them to adopt, and then hope for social spillovers? Right? It's not completely clear unless we work through the data and the model carefully, right? And also, if we might want to think about whom to target with a discount. Maybe there are some people who have outsized social influence on others, right? Outside demand externalities on others, right? And in a situation like this, even simply the price elasticity of demand, you cannot calculate without thinking about the strategic complements. Okay. And so here's what we're going to do. So we're going to run a very large-scale randomized control trial in rural Bangladesh. It'll cover an entire sub-district, and the RCT will cover about 18,000 households or about 75,000 people, right? So we have lots of degrees of freedom to try out many different things. And we'll design the RCT specifically to get at social spillovers. And I'll have to be clear about how we do that. But then we are going to have to combine that RCT with some structural estimation. And the reason is that the processes I described, where my decision affects your decision, right, makes this a fixed point problem. Meaning that if I target some people with a subsidy, so if I get a subsidy, right, I adopt, right, but then when I adopt, or a few of us adopt, social norms start changing, right? So even if you don't receive a subsidy, that might get you to adopt. Okay, and if you start adopting, so social norms change even more, then that might have a feedback effect on my adoption, right? So the effect of a subsidy is not just, what is the direct price effect of somebody who gets a subsidized when there are decision interlinkages. So that's the model that we'll work through, okay? How is it that there are these feedback loops, and how do we estimate demand when there are interlinkages like this? And then we can, once we have that model, we can answer questions like, what is the optimal way for us to distribute the $100? What are the effects of targeting certain types of people who might be more price elastic? So let's say poorer people, right? Is that better than targeting people who are less poor? Can we target different types of communities where the social interlinkages might be stronger? And do we get more spillover out of that, et cetera? So we can answer all those questions, both from the experiment as well as counterfactual policy questions. Okay? And if it is indeed the case that there are certain subgroups of people who are more price elastic, who will then adopt and then generate greater social spillovers, right? We might be able to improve subsidy policy design and get more bang for our buck, so to speak. Right? Okay, and the quick point I want to make here is that while this is a paper on sanitation, right, as long as there are interlinkages, right, across for any kind of technology or product or behavior across households, right, then we have to confront these types of spillover effects, or these what I'm calling feedback loops, right? And for a very large peer effects literature, right, you see this to be the case. We know that in agriculture, technology adoption decisions are interlinked across households because people learn from their neighboring farmers. We see this for a large class of many different health products, not just sanitation, but bed nets, deworming pills, hygiene. We also see this in other facets of economics and social science. So investment choices in Brazil. This is a experiment in Brazil where whether one investor invests in a mutual fund depends on what other investors in their social network are doing. This is true for labor effort. This is also true for, say, labor force participation by women, right? Women are more likely to participate in the labor force if the norm is that women participate in the labor force and there are more women in the labor force, right? So there's many classes of products for which this is relevant. And so if you want to evaluate policies to promote any of these technologies or products or behaviors, you do have to confront the fact that decisions are interlinked. And I hope that our model is going to be relevant for cases like that. Okay, so we're going to run this experiment in Bangladesh, and in particular northwest Bangladesh, which is the poorest part of the country, and about a third of households practice open defecation at baseline. Okay, so we do some information campaigns, but on top of that, we do subsidy lotteries, and I just want to put this picture up to show you that all the subsidies that we give are done in public, so people know who else is getting subsidies at the same time. Okay. And here's the experimental design. So first of all, we'll have village level variation where some villages will be there'll be subsidies allocated and other villages will be controlled without subsidies. But the villages that will have subsidies allocated will have another type of variation, which is that we'll randomly vary the saturation level of the subsidies. So in some villages, so let's say a village over here, we'll give the subsidies simultaneously to up to 25% of the poor population. In other villages, 50%, in other villages, 75%. Okay, so that type of random variation is going to be useful because now that changes, holding my own price constant, how many of my friends are receiving subsidies at the same time. Okay, and then within each of those villages, which individual gets the subsidies randomly assigned, and we have two different types of subsidies, which creates 4 different price points for each individual. They can be in one of four cells where they get very lucky and win 2 vouchers, or 1 or 0. Okay, so putting it all together, this is what an average village looks like. In a low saturation village, the proportion of winners is low. In a medium saturation village, higher. And then a high saturation village, the proportion of winners are going to be very high. So I'm going to have 2 types of variation going on. Individual level variation on who gets a subsidy or not, as well as village level variation on the proportion subsidized. Okay? All right, so now before launching into the structural estimation, let me just tell you in reduced form what the effects are. I know the clicker doesn't work because it's HD thing. Okay. Oh, perfect. That'd be great. Thank you, Marianne. Okay, so here's what's happening. Let's just look at hygienic latrines, okay? So there are some people who get lucky. They're called the winners. They're on the right side of this graph, right? And the people who get unlucky and don't get a subsidy, they're the losers, right? But they live in villages where other people are being subsidized, right? So first you see that the winners are more likely to have adopted hygienic latrines relative to the losers. This group is higher than this group, right? So that just says that the demand curve is downward sloping. People react to price subsidies. But second, if you look at the winners, but in the 25% village versus the 75% village, you see that the winners in the 75% village are more likely to react to the subsidies by actually investing in a latrine. Okay, so this person and this person are actually both facing the exact same own price, right? Except that this person has more friends getting subsidized at the same time. So just from in the reduced form, it looks like these decisions are strategic complements, right? You're more likely to adopt if more people in your community are simultaneously likely to adopt. Okay, so in the model, this is the only slide I'll have with any equations, I think. We'll have utility of adoption is going to be a function of own price, but also a function of the average level of adoption in the village. And this is what creates a fixed point, okay? Because this adoption rates, which aggregates up here, which makes up that S bar, okay? And so in a model like this, I'm not going through the estimating equations. This is standard IO demand estimation except for the S bar, okay? So there's going to be P and S bar, these matter. And these normally have very severe endogeneity problems. So price is endogenous for the usual IO type reasons. But on top of that, you have S bar being endogenous because of correlated unobservables. This is what Chuck Mansky calls the reflection problem, okay? So we need two different instruments for these. And as I already described to you, our RCT was designed to instrument for these two things. So the household level random price variation will be the perfect instrument for P. And then the saturation variation, 25%, 50%, or 75% of households getting subsidies, that'll be the perfect instrument for S bar. Okay, so we'll use these two instruments to estimate those two parameters. And this is, of course, I'm going to show you simulation results. But before I do that, I'll just show you two tables of regressions, only to show you that we estimate things pretty precisely here. And the reason is we have a lot of data. We have 18,000 households. And if I just limit myself to the set of households that are eligible for subsidies, that's around 13,000. Okay, so price coefficient estimated precisely. And we also have many neighborhoods here, many different communities. We have about 385 communities. Right? And we have many people within each community. So my S bar coefficient is also estimated quite precisely. Okay, so now with standard errors out of the way, let's just get into what the simulations show and the counterfactuals show. Okay, and how do I solve this? The fixed point problem. So from my model, which is the logit formula, the model tells me what S bar should be. Right? At initially estimated values, these are parameters that I estimate, all the alphas and the gammas. That tells me what S bar is, but look that this is a recursive formula. S itself is a function of S bar. So what I'll do is, I'll say now do a simulation where I'll provide some subsidies. So price goes down for some people. So that'll have a direct effect on their adoption, which changes S bar. So let's say I get S bar 2 over here, right? Then I can plug S bar 2 back up here, right? Recalculate, that gives me S3, go back and forth, S4, S5, until I get to the new equilibrium. Right? So that's how I'll have the direct effect as well as the indirect effect. So now in the rest of the time, I'll just show you some results and we'll be done. So all the graphs are going to look kind of like this. So let me just spend 30 seconds explaining what this means. So in this, on the x-axis, think of this as the baseline share adopting, because with the theory of strategic complementarities, you expect that if adoption rates are high to begin with, then people might be more reactive to subsidies. Right? So I have different villages at different baseline rates. And on the y-axis is my effect size of the experiment that's up here. Right? So this would be the experiment giving people a 2,000 taka subsidy for latrines. And what you see is that blue line is going to be the direct effect, the own price effect. And then when I go through those, through the feedback loops, that gives me the total effect. That's the red line. Okay, so here's the effect of giving a 2,000 taka subsidy. So you see a direct effect and then a positive spillover because the S bar coefficient was positive. Here is what happens with 3,000 taka. Here's what happens with 4,000 taka. Right, so what you see is that, of course, the direct effect gets larger, right, because demand curves are downward sloping. But then also the gap between the two lines get larger because, the S bar effect, the indirect spillover effect on others' adoption gets larger and larger when there's more of a direct effect. Okay, and this is just to show you where all the data are. Most of my data are going to be in this baseline share between 0 and 50%. Okay, so it's really the positive slope part of the line that will matter most. And the fact that we have a negative slope here is partly coming from the logistic functional form. Okay, so now let's do some other experiments. So imagine that we gave subsidies to only people who are relatively less poor among this poor population, people who have some land.
Okay, so in the estimates that I went over very quickly, it turns out landless people, people who are extremely poor, are very price sensitive, right? And if they're very price sensitive, they're more price elastic, so they're going to be more reactive to subsidies, right? So here's what happens if I were to subsidize the relatively less poor. Here's what happens when I subsidize the landless, the very poor. If you put those two together, what you see is that if you target subsidies towards the very poor who are more price elastic, I get more of a direct effect, and on top of that, I'll get more of a spillover effect, right? So I get more bang for my buck by going after the type of household that is more price elastic, okay? So government policy can be a little bit more efficient per dollar, right? If you can identify subgroups that are more price elastic. Okay, and now here's another experiment I can do, which is imagine I have the same subsidy budget, right? And I give everybody 1,000 taka subsidy, or I give half the people 2,000 taka subsidy, or a quarter of the people 4,000 taka subsidy. So I'm trying to keep the subsidy target the same. Okay? And what I get is if I target subsidies in a more concentrated way rather than a dispersed way, I get larger adoption. Okay? So this is something that couldn't have been, it was an empirical question. It wasn't easily predictable based on the model itself, right? It just so happens that people react more strongly when subsidies are targeted in a more concentrated way. However, the issue here is the reason I get more adoption here is because people react to their own price. So I'm having to give out more subsidies because when I give out 4,000 taka subsidies relative to 1,000 taka, right, more people take up. So the total budget I have to expend on subsidies is going to be larger, right? So that is also true. So not only do we see this kind of effect of concentration across households, if I concentrate in certain villages and not others, I get the same type of result. So here, I focus subsidies on a quarter of the villages, but heavily subsidize them. And here, I widely disperse subsidies across all villages. Okay? And I get the same pattern, which is that if I concentrate subsidies in certain villages, I get a larger effect. And this is coming from the fact that there are these spillovers within village, right? That's creating more of an indirect effect on adoption. Okay? But again, of course, we have that a larger budget gets expended here. Okay? So now what I want to do is talk about, okay, since a larger budget gets expended, let's try to make it truly budget neutral. So we even keep the subsidy budget the same. Okay? So when I keep it truly budget neutral, so what this graph is showing you, too bad this, okay. What this, I think it's out of battery or something. It's just blinking. I'll stay here. That the blue parts are the direct effects and the red parts are the indirect effects. Okay, the blue parts what you should take from this is that the blue parts are much larger than the red parts, right? My own price coefficient is very large relative to the S-bar coefficient, right? So what that means is that if I want to keep things truly budget neutral, my result actually gets reversed, right? That then if I give 100% of the population subsidies, I don't have to give them 1/10 of 5,000 or 500 taka. I can actually afford to give them 1866 because the take-up rate was lower there, right? But overall, I get a larger effect, okay? So then what ends up happening is, the left graph is what I already showed you. There's benefits of concentration, right? But if I do something truly budget neutral, the result reverses. So which graph you care about really depends on your objective function. If you're really interested in maximizing adoption, because let's say that the real cost of running a subsidy program like this is all the consultants you have to hire in Washington, D.C., right? In that case, you might not care too much about the subsidy budget. You might want to care about maximizing adoption, in which case you want to concentrate subsidies in certain areas. But if it's the government of Bangladesh running this and they really care about the subsidy budget because they don't hire high-priced consultants from D.C., then you might want to care about the graph on the right, okay? All right, and then I'll just say two more things before I stop. Okay. So this is a community level characteristic. So some communities are just densely populated, others not. So I'm looking at the variation in effects across dense or less dense communities. And what you see is if you go after more dense communities where social spillovers are larger, right, you get more bang for your buck. Okay. So you could do this type of analysis heterogeneity with community level variation, or you could do, as I showed you with the landless guys, household level variation. Okay. And finally, okay, to understand mechanisms, I did what I thought was a clever experiment.
right? And it totally backfired. So let me just tell you that sad story, and I'll stop there. Okay. So here's what I did. So I thought that, okay, let me try and maximize social spillovers by going after connected guys, right? People who will be socially influential. So the idea is that before I run any interventions, I first collect a full social network census data, asking everybody about who you're connected to. And through that process, I can identify people who are very central, very well connected, right? I call them highly connected individuals, HCI. Okay? And then I run this experiment where in some villages, I identify those HCIs and I secretly bias the lotteries in favor of the HCI guys. And in other villages, I don't. And the idea was maybe when I bias the lotteries in front of HCI guys, then I'll get bigger social spillovers, right? And except the exact opposite happens, okay? What happens is that when you bias the lotteries in favor of HCI guys, you don't have as big a social spillover as you do with the non-HCI guys. And in particular, people who win vouchers themselves, they react a lot more strongly to non-HCI, like marginal people, socially isolated people, getting vouchers. So why is that? So here's a model. This is ex post theorizing on my part. This is the last thing I'll say. To be clear, it's ex post theorizing. This wasn't my prediction. Here's a model that's consistent with what we're observing, right? This is consistent with the model of shame. So if a poor marginal person, right, now stops defecating in the open and uses a toilet, then it's very shameful for you to continue doing it, right? Whereas if a rich central person invests in a toilet, right, there's not as much shame if you're poor to continue going out in the open. Okay, and it's particularly shameful if you got a voucher yourself and you still didn't react to the fact, and while poor marginal people in your village did. So I was able to actually, like, after thinking about this model, test it, which is that because of all, the 18,000 households and lots of variation, it just so happens by luck that in some villages the leader types get subsidies, and in some villages other types, like people I'm connected to via, like, my kids play with their kids or things like that, they got subsidies. So what we see is exactly this, that when those perceived as leaders get subsidies, right, and others don't, there's actually a smaller effect on other people's adoption. Okay, and I see a bigger effect when those I'm connected to in the form of saying, this is the guy I would go to for technical help over some new technology. If I have questions about a new technology or new product, right, those guys are actually quite influential in other people's adoption. Okay, so let me stop. I'll conclude. So these methods, I've talked a lot about toilets today, but they're applicable quite broadly across lots of problems in, labor, economics, public finance, etc. And so whenever you have strategic complements or substitutes, the lessons that I would draw from this to evaluate policy in those settings is that, structural estimation is necessary, right? But to do proper structural estimation, you have to design RCTs to have these types of two-level variation, household level variation as well as community level variation. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I think we'll hold on your question. I think we move on to the next presentation for Professor Glaeser.
Thank you. That was great, Mushfiq. In 1960, none of the world's poorest countries, none of those countries with per capita incomes in modern dollars over $1,000, were more than one-third urbanized. Today, about 40% of such countries are more than one-third urban. Is this mic working? Are we still having problems with the mic? No. It's fine. It's fine. Okay, great. And so we have the rise of large cities, of mega cities, of places like Kinshasa and Karachi, in places that are both poor and poorly governed. Now, there is a great deal of hope in that. There's a great deal of prosperity that can come from that. There's a great deal of opportunity that can come from urbanization. But there are also demons that come with density. If two people are close enough to exchange an idea or to trade a product, they are also close enough to exchange a disease. And the great problem of urban management today requires battling those demons. The most important of them is contagious disease, but traffic congestion, crime, affordable housing, these are all different aspects of making the cities of the world more livable and more functional. And the prime battleground for that is in the developing world. Now, there is a history of this in the West, and what I'm showing you here are death rates in New York City from 1800 to today. In 1900, a boy born in New York could expect to live 6 6 years less than the national average. Today, life expectancy is 3 years longer in New York than elsewhere in the U.S. That change did not happen by accident, and I think overwhelmingly the best evidence suggests that it was water and sanitation that made the difference. That in fact these cities became healthy rather than places of death precisely because America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water at the start of the 20th century as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. Now, when we come to think about water and sanitation, there are an enormous array of fascinating intellectual topics which are actually crucial for public policy making. There are technological questions, right? There's a question of whether or not the right procedure is to build large-scale infrastructure, as we did in the West, or to follow the procedure suggested by the Gates Foundation of engaging in small, cheap interventions, right? One extreme example, of course, is just tablets, which makes the water taste funny and people won't use, but it will, in fact, make them somewhat healthier. A second deep question is what institution, if you're going to have large-scale infrastructure, what institution does it, right? Do we want to have a private provider, a nonprofit, a full-scale public provider? To what extent do we actually believe in the subsidies that Mushfiq was pointing and was emphasizing? Or will those be financially infeasible in many parts of the developing world, despite the fact that they can work? And Mushfiq has shown us to that. In the case of the West, we tended to use things that look more like penalties for non-adoption rather than subsidies for adoption. And so there is a robust research agenda that really is, in some sense, the most important thing that's happening in the cities of the developing world, which are arguably the most important places for the continuing prosperity and success of humanity, which involves knowing the costs and benefits of acting both on the treated, on their neighbors, and on the rest of the world, right? The spread of antibiotic-resistant disease is something which may be coming from developing world cities and impacting everyone. We need to know how institutions will operate in different settings. And theory can be helpful as well as RCTs or other forms of evidence in this case. And as always, right, we face the familiar trade-off between market failures and public failures. So before getting into the meat of the paper, I just want to highlight a couple of things. So first of all, I am struck by how many times in dealing with developing world urban problems, we have two technologies that balance against each other, right? Here we have jitneys and the GO train in Johannesburg. A cheap technology, a local technology, a technology that grew up on the streets, right? Also one that's unsafe, also one that is, has myriad quality problems versus this sleek first world technology that is unbelievably expensive and very poorly suited often for the developing world context. Similarly, you can build large public housing projects, think the City of God in Brazil, or you can have shacks, metal shacks outside of the core area. In the case of sanitation, you can have a pit latrine or you can have a modern sewage system, right? There's not a right answer about when you go to the fancy, expensive collective technology versus the cheap, small one. There's an answer that's context dependent, but one that very much needs to be answered. In the case of institutions, I think it's really important to remember that there are at least 4 primary models that have been used at different points in time in the West, right? There's public integrated. Think the city departments of public works that proliferate throughout the Western cities, or if you want to be even more literal, think transport for London, right? The #1 job of the mayor for London is directly running transportation. An alternative is public but independent. So this was the prevailing model in much of 19th century U.S. infrastructure investment. Think about the Erie Canal Commission or the Croton Aqueduct Commission or Robert Moses and his work on the Triborough Bridge Authority. All of these were seen as being a way to bypass the muck of corruption that brought down 19th century and early 20th century cities to provide a type of professionalism. But this is also the model of every malfunctioning parastatal enterprise in sub-Saharan Africa, right? So it is clear that this model can work, but does not always work. There's also a for-profit, independent model, right? We heard this morning about electricity providers and the Washington Consensus pushing towards more privatization. Well, sometimes that is the right answer. But often what you get out of privatization is just massive corruption of the state, right? It's not easy for a public sector to handle a highly incentivized private provider who is trying desperately to get as many rents out of the system as possible. And of course, there is the beloved not-for-profit independent structure. That's something that we all think about in terms of small-scale water interventions. But in 18th century England, they had turnpike trusts. There were nonprofits that actually managed their roads. Incentives come up again, and we just heard a whole paper on, so I'm not going to dwell on this, but it turns out this was the central problem in New York City in the 19th century as well. A prevalent problem that we see, Mushfiq was talking about latrines, but is the last mile problem. So the last mile problem is something we're all familiar with. Some well-meaning aid agency, maybe even the World Bank, has built a water main, right? And poor people aren't connecting to that water main. Costs in Zambia, where I work, it costs $1,000 to buy that connection. The government has a sort of blanket blanket policy, which is no subsidies. No subsidies. Clearly, they've read the 1994 World Development Report and know that they're not supposed to be subsidizing things. And so, poor people per capita GDP is 1,800, and poor people don't connect. Now, this is not new. If you just go back to this graph here, the great story of New York City infrastructure, which was told to schoolboys like myself in New York, is that New York was filthy until we built this amazing piece of infrastructure in 1842, the Croton Aqueduct, which brought in the clean waters and took the filth out. Well, anyone see a trend break in 1842 in this? Not at all. We were having cholera epidemics for another quarter century. My great-great-great-great-great-grandfather died in that one, in the 1849 cholera epidemic. And the reason was, of course, the last mile problem. That in fact, poorer New Yorkers did not connect to the water system. It was not until you had 1866 and the Board of Health penalized the landowners for not connecting to the water that you had this adoption. Now, there was an attempt to subsidize with hydrants, but in fact, there just wasn't enough money available in New York that anyone was willing to pay for those subsidies. Moreover, if you're going to give every poor person who comes to Lusaka $1,000 for a water connection, then you're going to be artificially subsidizing urbanization as well, which has its own particular issues. So together with Nava Ashraf, we pushed forward that the right way to think about this structure of incentives and fines and subsidies is that you want to think both about whether or not you want to engage in subsidizing, and you want to think about whether or not you want to penalize bad behavior. And the right way to think about this is whether or not you trust the judicial apparatus that would operate the fines or the executive apparatus that would operate the subsidies. Right? And it's a question of whether or not the losses are more severe. So this is meant to be a sort of theoretical structure. Along this axis is how awful your executive branch is, and along this axis is how awful your judicial branch is. Right? It's how good your judicial branch is. So if the judicial branch is good, you do it all with fines. If the executive branch is good, you do it all with subsidies. And there's a broad middle area which says, and I think this is particularly relevant, you want fines, but you want them to be small. Right? You want them to be small enough not to lead to abuse, not to lead to extortion, because once you have fines that are large enough to lead to extortion of the innocent, the whole system breaks down. Now, I understand that penalties sound inhumane, so let me put a human face on it, right? And again, this is particularly relevant in terms of open street defecation. I am, in fact, perfectly in favor of thinking about punishing small children for defecating in the street. The punishment I favor is if they do something that would terrify my own children, they will have to read for an hour in a community center, right? And read something that is actually good for them. So let's just put it, when I'm arguing for punishment, I'm not arguing for some draconian time in prison. When I'm talking about fines or some form of penalty that is appropriate for the community, maybe doing some community service of something, not something which is a draconian, awful thing to do to kids, despite the fact that my 9-year-old will tell you that I'm inhumane for requiring 45 minutes of reading from him occasionally. And another issue, of course, that is important in this is one of the things that made this easier in New York and is harder in the developing world is that you could have a penalty system. You could have fines imposed on landlords because you knew who owned the property. Right? And this is one of the problems with peri-urban areas in the developing world today. You don't actually know land ownership. And this reminds us of a basic point about property ownership. It's not just about empowering the owners, although it is about that. It's also about making the owners take responsibility for their own land. Shoveling ice in front of the property, connecting to the sewerage system, paying property taxes even that actually fund local resources. And a world in which we don't have measurement of who owns the property is a difficult world. This just reminds us that in poorer countries, no one is particularly confident about the judicial system's tendency to protect the poor. So in fact, these issues are both very rare. I will say one thing, again, a lesson from 19th century New York. When it came to policing these, to actually judging who had connected, they developed an entirely different sanitary inspection policy that was separate from the municipal police. So they actually didn't trust the corrupt cops, and they created a separate system that was actually dependent on the doctors for overlay. Now, the paper that I'm talking about today is specifically about Lusaka, and we're going to be talking about the impact of water breaking out. And I think I may lose you in a couple of the regressions that follow. I wanted you to take away 3 major highlights from this. One of which is that there are water breaks constantly in these areas, right? And this reminds us that our tendency to measure the share of households that are officially attached to water is a mistake, because being attached to water means a very different thing in suburban Maryland than it does in Lusaka, Zambia. Okay, the water doesn't go out 50% of the time. It actually runs 24 hours a day in Maryland. That is not the developing urban world experience. That's point number 1. Point number 2, okay, and this I have simply from a correlation that I'll show you in a second, but the incentives facing the providers matter. The Lusaka Water and Sewerage Company is vastly more likely to fix those connections that pay by volume rather than pay by the month. Okay, so in fact, the incentives, the very fact that they can collect unless the water flows, seems to be making them actually fix the problems much more severely, much more quickly. Which means, in fact, we want to pay attention to the institutions that the incentives that the institutions face. Third point is that, of course, we're talking about a lot of people who live very close to the margin of survival. And when the water goes out, a whole range of bad things happen, probably most prominently in health, but also in economic dislocation, also in the time spent studying by the young girls in the household. Because as has been true throughout history, right, when the water is disrupted, it's the young girls who end up, the young women who end up paying the cost. And they end up spending more time doing chores and less time acquiring human capital. So our identification structure does not rely, this is a map of Lusaka with water supply districts. We aren't going to be using any of the cross-sectional variation between these districts. What you basically need to believe is not that it's random that these areas have more breakages than these areas. What you have to believe is that one area having a break in April or April 5th, and another area having a break in March 7th, that's kind of random, holding the average frequency of outages constant, right? So it's all going to be with, of course, place effects and time effects. So you have to believe in the randomness of when you have the breaks in the water. And if you believe that, then we sort of have something like a natural experiment. Our data on the water breaks comes from Lusaka Water and Sewerage, and we have dates on complaints and how quickly these complaints are resolved. These complaints come in very different accounts. So this is a big burst in complaints about accounts. We will not be using the account complaints, right? So they're pissed off that, they think they're being charged for something they shouldn't be charged for. These are connection complaints. So we're going to be using the connection complaints. And the measures that we're specifically using are for every, we count the number of unresolved complaints at any point in time. We aggregate those up at the week or month level. We aggregate it up to the water district level. And on average, a water district receives a supply-related complaint every other day. So it's quite common that these complaints occur. So we're basically adding up the number of complaints in this water district. That's going to be our shock to water supply. We're going to be using 3 primary sources of data. We're going to be using administrative data on visits to geocoded clinics nearby that provide health data. We're going to be using zona transaction data, and we'll come back to that in a second, to measure economic dislocation. These are available at a very high temporal frequency. These are months. These are going to be weeks. And we're going to be using a detailed time use questionnaire from 2013 to show you about the young women and their time uses. I'm going to skip over the these are the types of diseases we're going to be looking at, the average supply days per month, zona transactions. This is the first thing I want to just show you. This is the correlation between the days of supply issue and the share of connections that are metered. Okay, and this is in a correlation framework, but it would all hold in a regression framework as well. So this actually is just at the place level. And this is telling you that when people pay by the meter, right, pay by the liter, when they pay by volume, just the share of outstanding supply days goes way, way down. And that's mostly about how quickly the complaints are resolved. They're resolved much more quickly when people pay by the liter than when they pay by the month. So that's what this fact is. And again, this is not an RCT, but it's a very strong correlation, and it makes such close sense to what our economic intuition would be about the incentives facing water providers that it's hard not to think that this is something important for us. Second thing is, these are the waterborne illnesses that you might expect to see going up when water gets dislocated. And you want to think about a model in which people are going and getting crappier water when the official piped water disappears on them. What you see is that we see an increase in non-bloody diarrhea, particularly among younger people, when you have more supply days in nearby health clinics. And you see an increase in typhoid fever as well, which is also waterborne. So these are the things you were expecting to see from waterborne dislocations. But then this surprised us. You also see a rise in respiratory infections, which seemed puzzling to us. But we sent people out in the field, and one of the things people do when the water doesn't run is they stop washing their hands. And if you think that washing your hands is actually useful, as indeed you can learn from any World Bank bathroom, to preventing contagious disease, you perhaps are less surprised that when the water goes out, people are getting sicker, not just from waterborne illnesses, but from other diseases that cleanliness strikes again. You even see a slight uptick in measles. That's concentrated in older kids rather than younger kids. In the case of measles, it seems quite possible that what's happening is that the immune system is being weakened by waterborne illnesses, and that's increasing that spread. This is not that more people are, when the water goes out, they're more likely to show up at the clinic. Other things like preventive care actually go down when you see the water go out. So this is the number of well child visits or vaccination visits. Those are actually going down when the water breaks. The zona transaction data is cool, but a little bit less overwhelming in terms of the effects. So this is banking in Zambia. So there are many more of these zona kiosks than there are actual branch banks. We have the full set of zona data, and what we're going to be looking at is whether or not zona transactions go down after the water breaks. So everybody comes to these kiosks, they give them their kwacha, the kwacha gets zapped to some other part of Zambia or some other part of Lusaka. And indeed, the effects aren't super strong, but indeed you do see a decline in the amount of zona activity when you have these water breakages. Last thing that I'll say something on this is just the time structure of this, which again has these negative effects at the booth level. Last thing, time use, and the most this is comes from time diaries of young women. When you have the water go out, they spend more time doing chores. And again, this one is not statistically significant. You do see, though, a suggestive evidence that they're spending a little bit less time doing schoolwork as well. Sample sizes aren't huge, more of a suggestion for future research. But it does seem, and our ethnographic research backs this up, that they're changing their time patterns when the water goes out. They're spending time getting the water instead of learning something. Last point I want to make, and I'm 1 minute and 40 seconds over my 15-minute deadline. So the cost of doing nothing. So there are arguments in old world development reports about the costs of subsidies and the dangers of acting in ways that open the floodgates towards waste. But there are potential huge costs with our current structure. Now, one of the reasons why the failure to act on water seems acceptable today, and it didn't seem acceptable in 1900, is that the cholera plagues just aren't as bad. We don't have people dying by the thousands as we once did in the cities of the West by waterborne illnesses. One of the reasons for this is better medical care. We have the rise of antibiotics, which can cure people much more quickly. In case of cholera, it's other medical treatments, not typically antibiotics. But what if the combination of bad water and antibiotics is leading to the development of antibiotic-resistant diseases? What if there is, in fact, a global threat that is created by our current strategy of dealing with the urban health issues, not with infrastructure, but with pills? So together with Marcy Alsen, and I was a doctor at Stanford and an economist, and two other co-authors, we've been looking at a survey of pregnant mothers from Hyderabad who are tested for the presence of antibiotic-resistant germs in their systems. And the key point is they didn't come in because they were sick. They came in because they were pregnant and otherwise healthy. So I'll just show you. This is proximity to standing water in Hyderabad. And this is the shares with one of these measures of the antibiotic-resistant disease. Again, this paper is not out. This may not survive our next round of coding for different forms of water. But there's almost none of this stuff when people live farther away from standing water. It's all when they're sort of close to our visual measures of standing water in Hyderabad. So it's at least a possible hypothesis that, in fact, water and the spread of water may be creating the fact that we're allowing these diseases to proliferate rather than actually getting them at the source by getting in cleaner supplies of water, may be creating threats that are dangerous to all of us. And I think I just want to end on that. Part of the motivation for focusing on water and infrastructure is to allow cities to do what they have been doing for thousands of years in terms of empowering upward mobility, empowering economic change, in providing a pathway out of poverty into prosperity. The other half is about the fact that we are in a world that is globally connected now. And when we try to handle things in a slapdash manner where we allow diseases to spread, we're posing risks for the entire world. So with that, let me end.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, let's move to Richard and to Jim before we open up for questions. We're not against subsidy per se, right, Professor? You know that. We're against bad subsidy. Right.
All right. Thank you so much. Maybe I'll use this one. Can you hear me with this? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Now that's a really hard act to follow. So what I'm going to do is to try to give you a summary of 5 papers in 15 minutes. I don't want to delay your wine and your dinner, so I'm going to have to be very, very efficient and very quick. And of course, that implies also that the coverage is going to be light. So what I'm going to do is summarize the results from a report that we just put out entitled Uncharted Waters. And what this report does is it tries to look at some of the big water challenges that we actually confront globally. And it begins with the proposition that there are two irreversible trends that we confront when we worry about water. The first, what we've done in this slide, is to simply look at the fertility rate of population growth and overlay that with the availability of water. And what you see in the places that are marked red is these are places that have high population growth and are going to encounter water stress and water scarcity as we go down over the years to 2030 and 2050. Regrettably, we also notice many of those countries are poor, they're fragile, and at times they're in conflict. Obviously, I'm not asserting at this stage anything about causality. The second big challenge, regrettably it seems to be irreversible at this stage, that we have to deal with is climate change. And there's much that we could talk about in terms of climate change and water and what the various models tell us. But for this particular piece of work, all we take away from those models is that with climate change, rainfall will become much more fickle and extreme, and we will see many more of the kinds of extreme events of the sort that we observed in this country earlier in this year. And we don't have to look at the models or just conjecture about it. If we look at the data is indicative that we are seeing these extreme events. And what you're seeing here in the orange are rainfall episodes, dry episodes of rainfall that are more than one standard deviation from the mean. In the orange, they've occurred for 6 out of 10 years, and in the red for 7 or more out of the 10 years. So these are the dry shocks. If we look at wet shocks, we observe a similar pattern. So we are seeing more of these dry shocks, and we are seeing these wet shocks, and it's clearly something for us to worry about. And what we do in Uncharted Waters is we explore the consequences of a baseline of expanding water scarcity together with growing dry shocks and growing wet shocks. And we explore the impacts on farms, because of course farms are on the front lines of rainfall and climate change. We explore the impact on firms in the city, because firms and cities are where 80% of your GDP is produced. And finally, at the center of this all, of course, are families, because of course people are what matter in terms of the impacts. So let's begin very quickly on the farm. We ask what are perhaps 3 foundational questions. Firstly, we ask, if you get dry shocks or wet shocks, what is the impact on agricultural productivity? And of course, there's been a lot of work done on this, and we'll confirm much of your intuition about this. But then, assuming that there are these impacts, the next obvious question that we ask is, do these impacts cascade and spill into natural habitats and forests? Turns out much has been conjectured about this, but certainly we could find no empirical evidence, and we try to cast some light on this issue. And finally, of course, given that there are impacts, it's important to know whether infrastructure and policies work, and if they don't work, why don't they work? And if they work, why do they work? So, the only equation that you're going to see over here to give you a sense of the intuition of our empirical strategy is this one. For the first question, which is about the impacts on agricultural productivity, we use as our dependent variable net primary productivity, NPP. This is a global satellite measure of yields, and this means we don't have to worry about apples and oranges and comparing wheat with rice. The other great thing about using NPP is we can convert that into calories, so we know what the impact on food supplies actually is. And what we look at is precip is a binary variable, saying either you've had a positive shock of 1 standard deviation or more, or a negative shock of 1 standard deviation or more. And identification relies on assuming that the precipitation shocks are random. And indeed we test for that, and we cannot reject the hypothesis that these are in fact random or white noise. So that's really the essence of it, and then the rest is of course the usual controls and all the rest that you put in over there. Okay? So basically we have plausibly exogenous variation in rainfall, and that's what we test for. So let's begin by asking, what is the impact on productivity? What's the impact on dry shocks? Well, pretty much what you would have predicted. Dry shocks lead to a decline in agricultural productivity on average, and you get more of a decline in arid areas because arid areas, of course, are more sensitive to rainfall. What about wet shocks? Well, this might surprise a number of people, but we find on average, globally, wet shocks are good for agricultural productivity. And the reason is most agriculture is occurring in areas that receive less than the optimum amount of rainfall. So more rainfall tends on average to be good for productivity. Given that these dry shocks are leading to losses, what does it tell us in terms of the global magnitude? Well, it turns out that these dry shocks lead to a loss of food production sufficient to feed 81 million people. That would be a country about the size of Germany. Clearly, these shocks aren't occurring in Germany. They're occurring in those red countries, those poorer, those fragile countries of the world. So it's quite a significant loss of food production that we're encountering. Given that we have these shocks, both wet and dry, what can we say for the expansion into natural habitats and forests? We could tell a number of stories, theoretically. On the one hand, theoretically, we could conjecture that perhaps we get good rainfall shocks, we get good episodes of rainfall, agricultural productivity goes up, agricultural profits go up. Because farm profits are higher, farmers might be induced to expand into forests, assuming that you can and the land is available. You could also tell another story, that if you get bad rainfall shocks, say dry shocks, profits are down, your incomes are lower, then to recover your income, you expand into the forest frontier. And the latter would be the safety first model, that we've seen quite a lot of those sorts of models in agriculture. So what do we find? The bad shocks lead to an expansion, or the good shocks? Well, it turns out that the dry shocks lead to an expansion of cropland into the forest frontier, and for some regions we can explain about 60% of the deforestation that you observe. So this is a driver of deforestation that we think has been neglected in the literature. What can we say about wet shocks? Well, we can find no statistically discernible impact of wet shocks. Now, perhaps in terms of the big picture, this is a significant story and something that we should worry about. If it's a robust result, and we think it's a robust result, it's because if dry shocks lead to more deforestation, we are destroying our carbon sinks, which in the long term would worsen climate change. You get more dry shocks, and we end up in a downward spiral. So what can you do about it? So one of the key things we test for in this report is how effective is infrastructure. And of course, as we all know, for most of you people sitting over here when dealing with infrastructure, you have to worry about the endogenous placement of infrastructure. Here we quite closely follow the literature in going through what the IVs are. I don't think I have time to go through all of them, but very, very happy to discuss it. But suffice it to say, we're very, very close with the literature and everything that's been done with it. So what do we find when you use the IVs, use two-stage least squares, correct, test, 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 and you keep going? What we find is generally irrigation infrastructure works, and it acts as a it acts as a reasonably good buffer against rainfall shocks. In terms of the ups and the downs, it provides you with a good buffer, with a notable exception, and this exception is in arid areas. So what's happening in these arid areas is we provide irrigation water, we provide that water for free, and farmers end up growing water-thirsty crops such as rice, sugarcane, and cotton. These are the three most water-thirsty crops for which we have data. And then when the drought comes, and we know the drought will always come, productivity collapses, and the farmers are worse off than they would have been without the infrastructure. So clearly what's happening over here is we are providing precisely the wrong kinds of economic signal. In the middle of a desert, you're providing free water, so you're signaling abundance, whereas water is in fact scarce. And what you have here is a classic example of maladaptation. So the moral of the story is not that you don't do the infrastructure, but you provide the right kinds of economic signals and the right sort of demand-side management that is required. Okay, given that you have these impacts, it's clearly incumbent upon us to work out what the effect is on people and families. And here we use DHS surveys, and we focus specifically on Africa. I know many of you over here looking around have worked with the DHS surveys, so I'll be very brief. These are surveys that focus on women. They tell us about the health status of women, the wealth, how many children they have, and so on. And we take our motivation from this very large, extensive literature in health economics that tells us if a child in her infancy in the first 1,000 days of her life encounters a deprivation, it could be sickness, it could be lack of food, that child does not grow to her full mental potential or her full physical potential. If a child does not grow to her full mental and physical potential, clearly this will impact her future and what happens later on in life. So we ask and we test for the obvious effect. Do rainfall shocks in a child's infancy in the first 1,000 days of her life affect her as an adult? And remember, with these DHS surveys, we update on education levels, wealth, and so on. So what do we find? When a dry shock descends, we know there's going to be less food and all sorts of other things happening. So the child won't grow to her full physical and mental potential if she is affected and if she's undernourished. So she spends fewer years in education. She has less human capital, so she has less wealth. Only in very extreme cases of extreme shocks do we find an impact on height or stunting. That's not a robust result in the paper. What about wet shocks? We find exactly the opposite effect. With wet shocks, there's more food around, there's likely to be less of the disease that goes around with a shortage of water, and we find no impact on height. But of course, there are a large number of social variables that we can test for, so surely we do that too. And we find that the woman who encounters that rainfall shock in the first 1,000 days of her life, of course, she is less educated, she gets married earlier, and she has more children. There's a question in the surveys on interpartner violence, and she's more likely to say, yes, interpartner violence is acceptable. But it gets even worse than that, because we know about the biometrics of her children, and we find that her children are undernourished and less healthy. Now, given how devastating and depressing these results are, we test to see what sort of policies help. And we test to determine whether infrastructure helps. Well, it doesn't help enough, because these people are still poor. So the shock still affects them. The infrastructure does not act as a complete buffer. And what we argue very forcefully in the report is what you really need is safety nets, and the kind of safety net will differ. In some countries it could be a workfare program, in other countries it could be food, it could be income support, it doesn't matter what, but we need safety nets for when droughts descend. All right, so that was a grim tale. Let's see if we can cheer things up by moving to the city. And the focus now is on firms, and many of the results that Ed found with much, much better data than we have, I could say we largely confirm. So I'm going to go through this very quickly. So we test for both dry shocks and wet shocks in cities, and most of our analysis, but not all, is on Latin America, because that's where you have much better data than almost anywhere else in the developing world. And we find that small shocks, be they wet or dry, have no discernible statistical impact on city income levels or city employment levels. Large shocks, however, do have a negative impact on income levels and city employment levels. But perhaps that's what you expected. But what was surprising that we discovered was that a dry shock has 4 times as large an impact of a wet shock. And now that often doesn't seem plausible, so of course you have to test and try to find out why you actually got that result. And to understand why you have got that result, we need to understand a little bit about the pathways through which dry shocks do their damage and the policy response. And what we find is when there are dry shocks, there are more power outages, because we know all forms of energy require power, and that of course is going to slow your city economy. We also found, very much as Ed said, when there's less water and you get these dry shocks, there's a greater spread of disease. For countries where we have data on hospitalization rate, we see a spike in the hospitalization rates. Then we take another data set from the World Bank's Business Enterprise Surveys, and we find that when you get dry shocks, firm sales slow down, and they slow down very much more in the informal sector. And in most developing countries, the informal is a normal form of employment, so the impacts are large. Now, our view of what we're finding over here is that dry shocks are much less visible than is a flood, than is a wet shock. When a flood descends, say a bridge gets swept away, this brings in the television cameras, this brings in the politicians, it brings in the aid, and you get the reconstruction. With a dry shock, it's a silent emergency. It's misery in slow motion. It's less noticed, so the aid is much, much slower coming in. As a consequence, it does very much more damage. So, given all these impacts, what can we do about this? We argue when dealing with water, regrettably, there is no panacea, there is no single silver bullet that's going to solve all of these problems, because the impacts of water are so widespread and so interconnected. Indeed, we can think of this as a policy chain. And like any policy, it's only as strong as its weakest link. So there's about 5 or 6 key elements of this policy chain that we have to get right to solve the world's water problem. So let's start with this infographic. Let's start at the very top. Now, water at its source is a public good, is an environmental good. And to protect the sources, we need environmental policies, essentially to protect the watersheds, because the watersheds are where your water is really stored, where it's filtered, and where it's distributed when it's most needed. So we need environmental policies at the top. But that water is not terribly useful unless we have infrastructure to turn it into a private good and an economically useful good. So we need dams, and we need irrigation canals, and we need pipes, and then we send that water to farms. As we saw, when we send that water to farms, and we usually do send it for free, then farmers overuse and abuse that water. In the middle of a desert, you start growing rice and all sorts of things that you ought not to be growing, and problems occur as a consequence of that. When it comes to the city, we've seen, just as Ed said, the big impacts occur from the irregular water supplies. Firms know they're not going to get water. You really don't see much of an impact. But when you get this fluctuation that's unexpected, that's when the big economic damage actually happens. And we use a little bit of the standard game theory to argue what you should really be doing to control these natural monopolies, which are the water utilities. And finally, when it comes to families, we argue forcefully, as I said earlier, for the need for safety nets. But of course, water is, a molecule of water is used and reused several times. The water that comes out of your tap here has probably been reused about 6 or 7 times. So the quality of the water that goes out is terribly important. So once again, for all of that water, we need environmental policies to make sure that one person's use is not hurting the next. And with that, I think I should end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for also sticking to the time. That's a fascinating story. So now I'm going to pass on to Professor Jim Hall for providing some comment, particularly from the policy implications, because that's what we want to get to, and then we'll open up for question and answer. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And the first thing I would say is how great it is to see water on the agenda at an infrastructure meeting. Now, that might be a surprising thing to say, given that we've just spent the last hour hearing how essential water is to human well-being in a whole range of different ways. But one of the long-standing laments of the water sector has been, notwithstanding everyone's recognition of its importance, water specialists struggle to get their arguments on the table of the finance ministries and cabinet tables. It's difficult to get it outside the environment and health ministries. And what the work, however, that in particular that Richard has done has begun to unpick that relationship between water and economic development. As we've heard, that's a difficult problem because of all of the issues of causality. We might speculate about that, for example, in relation to the hygienic transition, which we heard about from Ed, and we've seen as part of the development pathway of all sorts of cities worldwide. Which way did the causality go in those contexts? But what Richard and co-researchers has begun to piece together is an evidence base around that relationship between water and broader macroeconomic issues. That's obviously easier when you've got independent variables, and that's where the message is coming through with respect to climatic variability and the effect of shocks, as Richard has demonstrated, on large-scale economic outcomes as well as at smaller scales. On the other side, we think of water as having downsides and upsides, don't we? So the exploration of those harmful effects of water, I think, is quite well developed now. The growth-promoting effects of water through agriculture, hydropower, navigation, and so on, the story is much less clear, and the evidence in the large-scale economic statistics is difficult to unpick. But nonetheless, this body of work, which we've heard about this afternoon, I think is a very important step to get the whole question of water infrastructure much more widely recognised. The next question then is, then what? So once water infrastructure is recognised as being of large-scale economic significance, the next question then is around, well, what, when, where, how much, how? And that's where the evidence which we've heard from Mushfiq and Ed is so powerful, in that that's really beginning to unpack these precise questions around what works. And so these are really important contributions, I think, to fine-tune interventions. Of course, they lend themselves to relatively small-scale interventions, which is where RCTs, natural experiments, are most accessible. And so the residual question is around those questions of what, where, when, how much in relation to larger scale infrastructure investments. On the one hand, the water sector has actually been at the forefront of innovation in these larger scale questions of applied decision analysis, of decision making under uncertainty. Lots of work has been done around questions of dynamic adaptive pathways, around decision making with respect to climatic uncertainties. So in that sense, the water sector, I think, has been an innovator, and a lot of those methods are being transferred into other infrastructure sectors, like the energy and transport sectors. But on the other hand, these kind of subtle questions which Richard referred to around sequencing and combination of infrastructure and institutional interventions are still very difficult because they're very place-specific. But I was really attracted by Richard's final infographic, which somehow puts together something of a roadmap combining upstream watershed protection with infrastructure, with combinations of institutions around demand management, regulatory interventions, safety nets, and subsidies. So I think that's very valuable. The problem, of course, with water infrastructure, and this applies to all infrastructure, but let me just lament it in water, is, of course, it's costly. And what we heard from Ed was the particular challenge with water infrastructure around systems effects, the last mile problem, that you have to put a hell of a lot of stuff in place before you start accessing the full benefits of water infrastructure provision. And what we also find to confound that problem is that willingness to pay is surprisingly low, and cost recovery is problematic, particularly if one's including the full infrastructure capital costs alongside operation costs. So actually, we find that finance is a long-standing and thorny issue in the water sector, and it's only really in advanced economies, OECD countries with a large regulated asset base, that one can get anything approaching large amounts of private finance into the sector. If one thinks about blended finance in the developing country context, it seems to me that the slice of that blend which is attractive to the private sector is often rather small. The final point I'll make, given this is a green growth conference, is a reference to the environment, and Richard implied the unsustainable dependence upon the aquatic environment, which is we observe worldwide, that water withdrawals are unsustainable. It's an interesting phenomenon which is now materializing, connects with the what we heard about energy this morning, and the revolutionary role of solar, and in particular solar pumping, that when your marginal cost of electricity are zero, then there's not much disincentive to stop pumping. So that's a growing story, and Richard gave that fascinating example of maladaptation, of increasing storage, actually increasing vulnerability to the most prolonged climatic shocks. So I think of water in the same way as we commonly think of energy, as being a trilemma. Of navigating between affordability, security and quality of supply, and the environmental sustainability of water resources.
Thank you very much, Jim. Without further ado, let me open it up for question and answer. The only thing that I would add to, I think, Jim's comment is that I think we use water as a very broad term. We're talking about water sanitations. Sanitation is directly impact on water quality if it's not being addressed. In fact, you look at MDG era, if worldwide we're making good progress on access to water, but sanitation is actually very lacking behind. So this is part of the agenda that we focus on. And a lot of the work that we're doing on global advocacy is on this value in water, addressing the concern you raised about willingness to pay and the fact that large investments are needed. Let me stop here and open the floor for question and comment. If you can identify yourself and keep your comment to be brief, because I don't want to stand between here and the next cocktail. This gentleman here, and then you have the mic.
Thank you. Johannes Ulo of GSZ. I'd like to go back to Edward's presentation. I was quite intrigued by your figures on the relationship between these SUNA payments and water outages, and I suppose you took this as a proxy for purchasing power, the payments, but one could also, you did not, so probably you can elaborate on what was behind this. The question that I wanted to ask is whether you also looked into possible relations to more informal methods of payment or probably delay of payment, because one could also hypothesize that water outages lead to debts and so on.
Can I just have you repeat first? What thing did you think that I was relating to? The ability to make payments to the zona transactions or the metering?
The transactions.
The zona transactions. Okay, so the zona transactions we took as being a general measure of economic activity. So there's a certain amount of these which are just paying suppliers or not. So I think our view was not that they were being pushed to the absolute margin of inability to spend any money, but rather that they were spending their time dealing with water instead of actually doing more business activity or potentially dealing with illness. I think that's at least how we interpreted it.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll collect 3 questions, then we can answer them more efficiently.
Thank you very much. It was a fascinating, I think, session. I have a question for
Can identify yourself?
Oh, sorry, I'm Emmanuel Oriol from Toulouse School of Economics. I have a question for Professor Mobarak. I was wondering, you present this spillover effect, and they are very compelling, I think, but do you have any evidence about the effect when you have antagonist community like a caste system or ethnicities that oppose people, whether this spillover effect will be the same or there will be, you have a toilet, I don't like your community, so I don't want to have a toilet. Will the effect will be the same, or which one we should target?
Okay, just hold on a second. Gentlemen here, I'll collect 3 questions and then.
Yeah, Paul Eakins, University College London. One very quick comment to Richard about your irrigation increasing vulnerability. I've just had a PhD student who's finished and has found that absolutely categorically in Rajasthan, that irrigation of poor subsistence farming families increases their vulnerability, and it was a nice control study. But I just wanted to add, this may be a trivial anecdote, but I was interested you mentioned chlorine tablets rather than what seemed to me to be a small-scale technology for drinking water, which is plastic bottles. And, of course, they weren't available to the same extent that they are now. I was amazed when I checked into my hotel last night in Washington that before I'd been there for half a minute, literally before I'd been there for half a minute, I was offered 2 bottles of water by various members of the hotel staff, to the extent that I said, well, what's wrong with the Washington water? Don't you purify it anymore? Oh, no, it was fine to drink. But so I'm just wondering, I mean, given what Jim said about how expensive the last mile is, I mean, have we seen the end of, in these big developing country cities, have we seen the end of attempts to supply drinking water to the whole population? And are we going to go down the plastic bottle route?
Thank you. Just one more question. Anybody? If not, okay, then go ahead, Professor.
So, Emmanuel, the general answer to your question is that, products, I talked a lot about strategic complements, which is that my marginal returns to adoption is higher when other people are adopting. Now, you could also think of products as being strategic substitutes, and I think that's probably what's going on with vaccines in the U.S. now, where, if 95% of people adopt and disease is eliminated, and you're in a country where you don't observe kids growing up with polio, right, then you become less likely to adopt, right? The model is general enough to handle cases like that. It's just that in our data in Bangladesh, they're very clearly complements. I've run similar experiments for other products or behaviors like migration. You do see migration decisions are strategic complements. So you do see lots of evidence of complementarity work effort. The work I was citing by Alex Mas, Enrico Moretti. So there, what happens is if I'm a grocery store clerk and I'm in the visual line of sight of another guy who's working harder, I work harder, right? In lots of cases, it's complements, but of course, there might be cases of substitutes as well.
I just think that's an open invitation. I mean, you need at least $5 million to run those experiments with Hindu-Muslim conflict in villages in rural India. I mean, I think we really want to know if the Hindus are more likely to adopt if you just give it to the Muslims and vice versa. I wouldn't have thought caste would work, because I think it's not clearly the conflict. And I could imagine going both ways, right? It may well be that you're yeah, absolutely. So just to respond on the water bottles, yes, the American fetish for giving away water bottles is truly bizarre. I'm with you on that. This is in some sense a back to the future thing, right? I mean, traditionally in the early 19th century, you had water providers who would carry around water that they would sell. The usual problem in the pre-modern era was you couldn't vet the water for its quality. So someone would deliver you water that allegedly came from a clean source, but how would you have any way of doing that? Now, you do have better ways of doing it. It's still more likely to be true for drinking water than for washing water, but it may well be that we're willing to tolerate dirtier water for washing water. I think the answer, at least that I tried to suggest in my slides, was, it's going to depend on context. And there are, I think probably in the case of water, my prejudices are strongly towards a systemic solution, whereas it's probably true in the case of transportation that I think we're probably a bit too fond of trains relative to figuring out how to make those jitneys safer and more functional. But it's going to depend on individual context. And if you are absolutely confident that the public water company is going to totally screw it up, then it may well be that bottles and tablets are the best game in town. One last point, though, following up on your excellent comments on willingness to pay. So the point that actually the private willingness to pay for water is often not high enough is absolutely right, but it's actually much more of an extreme problem with sewerage. And one way to think about this is that a lot of the benefits of drinking clean water are internalized by the household. Very few of the benefits of taking care of sewerage are internalized by the household. And, for example, so I was in Manila the summer before last, and in Manila, Manila is an amazing city, right? A city of 25 million people. They're overwhelmingly on septic tanks. Okay, so this is septic. This is not your nice suburban Virginia septic surrounded by 5 acres. It's a septic under a kitchen, under a bathroom, and it slops over with some degree of regularity, and it spills over on your neighbors. So the big problem Manila Water and Sewerage Manila Water Company was having was the households weren't even willing to accept free desludging on their septic tanks, because the free desludging, in fact, involves tearing up their kitchen to actually get to it. So even that marginal inconvenience was not enough. They weren't willing to pay that, let alone actually pay for the costs of dislodging. So, everything we think about the difficulty of getting people to pay with water is ramped up once you get to the sewerage case.
Thank you. I think the gentleman and then to Marianne.
Adam Siegel, Bottom Line Growth. Another person saying it was a really quite interesting panel in a lot of ways, so thank you. Two questions for Ahmed. Just wondering, in looking in the model in the specific that you presented, but also more generally, what about economies of scale? If you go into a community, did the costs external to the subsidy drive down the prices and therefore lead to or was it just a fixed price for that, for the toilets or the sewage treatment? And then, Richard, thank you again also for the presentation. The question, you alluded to it, but I'm not sure, of the damage from drought versus from severe dry versus wet. Were those impacts because, in essence, government and other institutional otherwise did not react in the same way that they react to a flood? How much of that relates to the impact, the differing levels of impact?
Just one more question from Marianne.
Thank you. As the member of the original 1994 WDR team, I will reveal my age, but I will contest the comment that Ed was making. And in fact, what the WDR did was to lament the poor design and targeting of subsidy and the fact that primarily results in underfunded utilities that have no money to invest in expansion or, in fact, in the proper running of the utility, right, and poor services. But then the recommendations were very basic. I was just looking at it recently, and it recommended things like increasing block tariffs, which we know don't really work for water because of the limited correlation between water consumption and income. So about 10 years ago, colleague Vivian Foster did a very nice little book on subsidies. But what we're finding right now is a need to revisit this issue of the optimal design of subsidies. And Guang's team is now launching a whole new work on this. And the idea is that there's been three types of changes that make this timely now. One is there's been this massive expansion of social safety nets and social registries, including in some very low-income countries, making it potentially possible to do much better targeting. A second thing is that there may be new technologies that could enable us to do better targeting or even reduce the need for targeting, for example, for water treatment plants that might be able to generate resources. And the third thing is, and this came up in a discussion with Guang's team recently, is this idea that we've typically focused subsidies on the design, on the expansion of networks, right? It's what we tend to subsidize is the expansion of networks, and they tend to be capital subsidies. And we, at least in an institution like the World Bank, tend to underestimate or sort of direct a lot less resources and subsidies towards things like latrines and those much more simple things that where maybe the bang for the buck actually is, rather than trying to put sewer systems that are so expensive. So just all of this is really just a comment also to say to Mushfiq and to others that, you know, any work these days that can help us improve the design of subsidies is really valuable, because there are so few, I mean, there's so little resource to put into subsidies that we simply can't afford to do a poor design of them. And that's it.
Thank you. So maybe Mushfiq and Richard can respond to that question.
Look, thank you for that question. There's a lot more work that we could actually do, but we certainly see the impacts of dry shocks coming from the pathways that we identified in terms of the power outages, firm sales slowing down, etc. And there certainly is evidence of a differential policy response that also occurs. The hard part is that how do you compare an equivalent drought to an equivalent flood when you're making such statements, right? So, you know, there is an element of interpretation in that, but it is very clear that the policy response to droughts and dry shocks is slow, is muted, and very often non-existent.
Okay, I'll answer the two questions in turn. So so you were talking about kind of supply side complementarities, right, which comes from the production side. Now, I totally agree that in the real world, when we start thinking about the effects of policies, we should be taking that into account. In our particular case, in that project, we knew there was going to be, we worked with the masons who produce sanitation parts. Right, we negotiated with them in advance, saying that we're bringing in lots of vouchers, we're going to fix some prices, tell me what prices you want, and it's all fixed, and so they couldn't react that way. But one story that did come out is that once this massive project started happening with, as I said, covering 18,000 households, the workers who work with those masons, they went on strike because they wanted to be paid more, right? So of course, there are going to be equilibrium effects in the market. And I guess maybe when I do my counterfactual exercises, I could do a version where I say, okay, imagine that there's a supply side response, and we take that into account. But the way I showed you the results was probably the right way to show it. Okay? And in response to Marianne's comment, a quick comment about the subsidizing sewage systems versus individual latrines. So I've been doing sanitation work in Bangladesh, India, and Kenya, in very different types of contexts. So both in rural and urban areas. What I showed today was rural sanitation. Now, in urban sanitation, where there's much less space, right, that's when you want to think about systemic solutions, right? Whereas in rural areas, right, where people are living far away from each other, I think these individual level latrines, with things like septic systems, right, that's the right way to think about things, because people are not willing to walk very far to have that inconvenience. But in urban areas, then you want to start thinking about, how do we subsidize shared facilities? But that brings up a new set of issues about who's going to maintain it, right? Set of industrial organization issues. What prices do we charge, right? And that's a much more complicated problem, right? But the subsidy policy should look different there. I do have a question for the other.
Okay. All right, please. I think we're just out of time, but we can extend it for 5 minutes.
So actually, just one comment for both presenters is, so what struck me in both of your talks is that people are going to adapt in various ways, right, in reaction to the types of policies you were talking about. So in Ed's case, when we do enforcement, right, people are going to figure out, what are the new rules and how do I continue my bad behavior under that new set of rules, right? And so when we analyze, the effects of policy, the theoretical diagram you had up there, right, we ought to be thinking more, carefully about how people react. And in Richard's case, this is not a criticism, right, for the wet shocks and dry shocks. I think you've identified things well. But when we move on to talk about, with climate change, let's say 80 million people will be without food, right? That's not accounting for the fact that, humans have huge innovative capacity, right? They might move to the areas with wet shocks, right? And as you showed with your irrigation story, right, they might change the crops they grow, etc.
Go ahead.
Or I certainly agree with Mushfiq's point about this. In some sense, I think that's one of the reasons why urbanization is potentially protective against these negative shocks, right? I mean, if you are connected to a global trading network, if you are selling services that can be then exchanged for wheat being grown in Siberia, you are protected in the way that subsistence agriculture in rural Africa is not. And I think that's sort of the central ensuring part of the world. You get more ability to adapt if you're more connected. The second point is I am being a little unfair to the WDR in 1994, and Marianne quite right. I was just going through it right now, and it is a subtle document. It is certainly possible to read Box 2.7 as being fairly strong on requiring financial autonomy for these institutions. And I should just say, I get that. That's not at all, it's actually, there's a lot to like in the World Bank's point for some degree of responsibility on the part of these entities. So I think I think the larger point is that, I wrote a lot of papers on social interactions in the 1990s. None of them made it into Mushfiq's talk. At least your papers from the 1990s are still being remembered. So I would be, I would be jealous rather than the other way around.
So, Mushfiq, that 80 million people figure comes from historically. That's how much we're losing now. There's no projections involved. So that's the magnitude of the loss of food. Of course, there will be adaptive responses, but it's much harder, what we argue in the report, to adapt to shocks that are unpredictable. You don't know the magnitude and you don't know the incidence, how frequently, rather than averages. And so what we look at is the other shocks, that effect. And also identification.
Okay. If there's no further questions, and you still have a chance to interact with our panelists tonight, assuming that they will be joining the cocktail and the dinners. I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of them for these fascinating presentations on the subject of water sanitation on the sustainable development context. Thanks very much. I'm not going to summarize this discussion. I think that Jim has already done that. So just want to say thank you